Many ancient historians, that is, historians of the ancient world, particularly loved the book of Acts, for it contains information they can get nowhere else. But the evidence is the information is true and correct. For example, have you ever heard of the name of Gallio, Gallio? He was proconsul of Corinth, one of three brothers. One of his brothers was Seneca, a very famous figure, but not a very good man. But he was the teacher of Nero. Reward: Nero ordered that the three brothers, Gallio, Seneca, and the third brother, should suicide, and they did that. We're soon to look at the most influential man in the ancient world next to Jesus, and that is Saul of Tarsus, who became known as Paul the Apostle. But before we look at Paul, there's another name in the early chapters of Acts. It occurs over and over. For example, when Stephen was giving a speech before he was martyred, he mentioned Moses, and he mentioned that Moses had foretold the coming of the Messiah, and he had said particularly, "This Messiah will be like unto me." And something else Moses is told of. It's said about Moses over and over in the scriptures that he was mighty in word and deed. Now, there are very few people in history that can fit that description. If you take any of the great writers we know of, like Shakespeare, Tennyson, take any of them, almost all of them were limited to greatness by the pen. But to find someone who was mighty in word and deed, that's almost impossible. Take the Old Testament writers. Isaiah was mighty in word. We don't know anything about great deeds. Take any of the prophets, 17 of them that have books in the Old Testament. All of them are great in word. None of them were great in deed. But Moses was great in word and deed, and he said the Messiah, when he came, he would be mighty in word and deed. And he also said, he'll be like unto me. Now that's very important. You read that in Deuteronomy chapter 18. There are about 71 parallels between the life of Moses and the deeds of Moses and the life and deeds of Christ. For example, when Moses was born, he was immediately threatened by a vile Pharaoh who wanted to kill him, but God protected him. Moses was told to flee ultimately from Egypt and to go into the desert. Now, if you read the opening chapters of the New Testament, you read that Herod wanted to kill all the babies of Bethlehem, and he did kill most of them, but not baby Jesus. Joseph was told to take the child down to Egypt. So Herod's plan to kill the new Messiah failed. But the day came when a message came again to Joseph. The people who sought the young child's life are dead. Return, go back and take the child. Interestingly, those very same words were said about the parents of Moses. When God saw it was safe, he gave the message, go, return, to the people who sought the young child's life are dead. Exactly same words. Read what it says in the opening chapters of Matthew. And in the index or the margin, you'll find a reference to the Old Testament where the same words are given. Go, return, take the child back. Those who sought his life are dead. Moses is said to have been learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. And we read in the 2nd chapter of Luke's Gospel that Christ was recognized as a child, as extraordinarily filled with wisdom. Of course, he was the Son of God. Moses spent a period of 40 in the wilderness before he delivered Israel. Christ spent 40 days in the wilderness before he came back to proclaim himself as the Messiah. Moses fasted on one occasion for 40 days. Jesus fasted for 40 days. Moses had a difficult, ungrateful, unspiritual generation to deal with. And although he interceded for them, though he was willing to die for them, they wanted to kill him. Even his own family criticised him, Miriam and Aaron. What about Christ? He had a difficult generation, and yet he could pray, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Christ's brothers, like Miriam and Aaron in the family of Moses, Christ's own brothers criticised him. There are over 70 parallels between the life of Moses and the life of Jesus. And remember, the ancient prophet said, when Messiah comes, he'll be like unto me. Moses became a great lawgiver. He was a prophet. He was a priest. He was a king. It says of him, he was the meekest man on all the earth. Remember, Jesus said, I am meek and lowly in heart. But Moses was very kind and very loving. Even when his own sister reproached him, he pleaded to God to heal the leprosy of Miriam. I invite you to read the early books of the Old Testament and compare them with the early books of the New Testament, and we see the fulfillment of Moses' prophecy that when Messiah came, he'd be like him. Moses brought darkness over all the land of Egypt, and as Christ was dying, darkness came over all the land. When the darkness was over in Egypt, the firstborn died, and many others in Egypt at the same time. And after darkness ceased at the death of Christ, within 40 years, same number of years that Israel rebelled against Moses, in AD 70, 40 years after Christ's death, over 1 million Jews died in the desolation of Jerusalem by the armies of Titus of Rome. When Moses died, he looked fit, he looked well. It says so. No one ever found his grave. And when our Lord died, it was in the prime of his life. And no one ever found the buried Christ, because he rose again. So I invite you, my dear friends, study the fulfillment of this wonderful prediction made so long before the birth of Christ, about 1500 years before, and find the truth of it. And ask yourself, how many men do you know of in history that were mighty in word and in deed? Usually someone that's good at writing words well is not very good at public speaking. Isn't that strange? But it's even more rare to have someone that's good in deed, in action, as well as in words. So Moses, who's mentioned several times before Paul comes on the scene, is an evidence in himself of the complete truthfulness and fidelity of the book of Acts. Now I want to talk to you about Paul. More books have been written about Paul than any other man who ever lived, except Jesus. I myself wrote a little book on Paul. I wrote this book nearly 60 years ago for Michigan State University, and in it I quote from many historians that say incomparably the most influential man in the ancient world was Paul, known originally as Saul of Tarsus. One of the greatest of historians, Sir William Mitchell Ramsay, said, when I came to the book of Acts, I didn't think I would find it true. But that is not so. I have found it wonderfully true. And he says about Paul, there'd be no Europe as we know it, but for Paul. He united the Orient and the Occident. But for Paul, we would know very little about ancient Greece and ancient Rome. When the barbarians swept over the Roman Empire, it was a Christian church that preserved much of the culture of Rome. One writer, Stalker, said he had hundreds of ideas, new ideas, no one else ever had. And I could give you, as I have in my own little book, quotation after quotation of scholars that say, Paul, the most influential man in the world except for Jesus. Well, it tells us in the 9th chapter of Acts that Paul was on his way to Damascus. He hated the Christians. He was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He'd been taught by Gamaliel. So he's riding on his high horse, and he has a very high opinion of himself because he's very intelligent, very bright. He's thinking to himself, I'll teach those Christians at Damascus, I'll tell them that Saul of Tarsus is much more important than Jesus of Nazareth. And thoughts like this are going through his mind when suddenly there's a bright light, brighter than the light of the sun. And he hears a voice saying, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And he's dazed, he's blinded, and he mutters, who are you, Lord? And the reply is, I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. Go on into Damascus, you'll be led there. You'll be blind for 3 days. You won't eat or drink. And then I'll tell you what you shall do. And so Paul, blind, only known as Saul then, only became Paul after conversion, goes into Damascus, 3 days blind, unable to eat or drink. Then one day someone knocks at the door by the name of Ananias, because Ananias had had a visit from Jesus. And Jesus said to Ananias, he is a chosen vessel unto me, even though he's been a persecutor. Go, touch his eyes, and he shall see. Right now he is praying. That's a wonderful statement. He is praying. You know, we think it's wonderful when there's someone who can sing well or write well. But Ananias is told to recognize Paul because he is praying well. We don't recognize how important prayer is. Tennyson was right. More things are wrought by prayer than the world ever dreams of. And every Christian knows in his or her own life the miracle of repeated answered prayer. When I was a boy of 15, I had no father, I had no money, and for me, very sad, I had no books and I had little education. So I prayed for all these things. I prayed the Lord would have me taught. The Lord would get me books. The Lord would give me an education, and that in His mercy He might use me to explain the scriptures to people. Years later, when my wife and I and two little children were marching a pram along the road to Avondale College, I looked at a slip of paper I had taken from the table before I left. It was one of hundreds, extracts of scripture. And this stick of paper said, "I will be with you in all the places that you shall go, and I'll bring you here again." Well, I've been in 40 countries since that night at Avondale College, but I was brought back safely. And in the mercy of God, I attended 3 universities for education. I read hundreds and hundreds of books. Later I would write about 40 myself. Do I believe in prayer? Dear friends, prayer to me is as real as breathing. And Saul was to learn to pray. And Ananias gets the message, "Behold, he's praying." So Paul has his eyesight healed. He begins to preach in Damascus, and after that he spent 3 years in Arabia. What on earth would he do? 3 years in Arabia? Well, he was thinking. He was studying. He was looking at the Old Testament and all it said about the coming Messiah. And when he came after 3 years back to Damascus and then to Jerusalem, he became a great preacher. You know, I have spent hours a day studying for about 65 years. And when I read the letters of Paul, I get the conviction that these are not inventions. These are wonderfully true. Paul touches the heart. He moves the mind. But it was because God was his teacher. And so, my friends, I invite you today, make Paul your study. He can change your life and change it today. Dear friend, don't miss this privilege. Study Paul the Apostle, and God bless you.